Good afternoon. Thanks, Claire. Claire and I go cycling a lot. Well, ever since we both said I do. I recently, 6 weeks ago, got married, so I'm still on my honeymoon, so that's my connection to honey. So, thanks for the yay. It took a while. And my wonderful husband is here. You can raise your hand. Okay. I actually have kind of an interesting task, considering there's not much research looking at honey and athletic performance. But as Dr. Gravetti pointed out, honey's been around longer than all of us. But actually dating back to ancient times, honey has been used as a performance-enhancing aid. And just to spin off of Eric had brought this up this morning about consumers and honey. Interestingly enough, over the past, say, 4 or 5 years, consumers, actually fewer of them do have honey in their household. In a 2010 survey by the National Honey Board, about 60+% of the households had honey. Actually, that's down from the year 2006, probably due to the low-carb, high-protein craze. But what's interesting is that honey, people will pay a premium for honey-flavored products. And just anecdotally to let you know that since I do have to glean through over 550 diet projects every quarter, and actually I should tell you a little bit about what I do. And Claire said I have the biggest nutrition class every single quarter, just so you can appreciate what I deal with. I have 550 to 600 undergraduates in Nutrition 10 in one classroom. And then I have 10 sections of Nutrition 11, which is a writing course in nutrition. So every quarter I have 850 students, roughly, thereabouts. But then I'm also the director of sports nutrition, so I deal with all the hundreds of intercollegiate athletes, and they come through my office. So every day is basically from the beginning to the end is dealing and talking about diet with young people, young active people, and it's great. So I thought I'd give you some background to my Honey Nut Cheerios comment that it hands down is the favorite. And I actually have asked and had an athlete last week, oh, Honey Nut Cheerios. Oh yeah, it's good for you, it has honey. So people do have the perception, and obviously, as Dr. Gravetti pointed out, medicinally, we've been believing in honey for years. So as far as honey's role in athletic performance, I do want to bring up that it's been around in connection with athletic performance for some time. You go back to literature, it's been used at the Olympic Games back in ancient times. Soldiers have taken it out onto the field. And it is viewed by athletes as a healthier option. And the question is it really? Does it offer some advantages potentially? What I actually did, thinking about this many weeks ago and always talking to athletes about it, is I interviewed, if anybody could recognize this person in the Olympic attires. This is from the 1972 Olympic Games. This is Kathy Carr West. She actually lives in Davis. She won 2 gold medals at the Olympics in 1972. That's the same year that Mark Spitz won his, whatever he won. But anyway, I know about what Kathy did. And actually, this is at a time when nutrition and athletic performance was really in its infancy. And Kathy shared with me what they used to do. And if you're familiar with how swimmers practice, they spend a lot of time doing a lot of yards or meters. They maybe swim 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters to swim a 100-meter event as fast as they can. So they spend quite a bit of time doing lots of yards, but it all comes down to a few seconds, literally. Kathy Carr West, is a breaststroker, and she was also as part of a relay team. And she said that they felt that they had the secret weapon using honey. She said that some people on some other teams use sugar cubes in between events because you have to swim some trials, so different heats of your event, and then whoever gets the top times moves on to the next heat. And Kathy said that they used to squirt honey down, really feeling very energized. And it's kind of interesting, she wasn't favored to win the gold medal or set a record in the 72 games, and she did both. She won 2 medals. But she also noted, she goes, oh, none of us would eat sugar cubes because they harken back to when they were, she did this when she was 16, not too many years before that when she was much younger. She would take sugar, or the sugar cubes were used as a means of dispensing the polio vaccine. So she said it wasn't the way to go, and nobody liked it. So as far as what do we know about honey and how it compares, we're going to compare carbohydrates, and we're going to do a little bit of Carb 101 here to help us get through it and talk about how could honey be considered as possibly something that may aid performance. Can it be as good as we know carbohydrate is as an ergogenic or work-enhancing aid? And just to give a brief comparison between a tablespoon of regular table sugar and a tablespoon of honey. So I'm comparing volumes, but because honey is a supersaturated solution, it does have a greater number of calories per tablespoon, 65 versus 49. Greater grams of carbohydrate. But what's interesting, and I want you to do a little note to self, that there are different carbohydrates present in honey, and the profile does vary a bit compared to table sugar, which is 100% sucrose, a disaccharide. Honey will look a little bit closer at in terms of its carbohydrate profile, but it has individual monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, and it also has a disaccharide, sucrose, and a handful of oligosaccharides, which are a bit bigger, more than a couple of monosaccharides put together, and it has a few unusual disaccharides in it. We also, because of bees' collection of pollen and nectar from plants, we can find trace amounts of, very small amounts of protein, specifically some amino acids, a collection of minerals like calcium and iron and zinc and copper and manganese and selenium. And I'm frequently asked the question is, could, if someone liked honey and they used it in their tea and in their over their cereal or mixed in their yogurt, couldn't they wasn't it a better way to meet their needs for essential nutrients? And as a lot of you honey experts know, you'd have to consume a phenomenal amount of honey to be able to meet your needs for iron, for example, which is perhaps the most prevalent trace mineral. Also, because of the bees' great job at collecting from plants, there are some compounds that we can refer to as collectively as phytonutrients or phytochemicals, but specifically phenolics and specifically flavonoids that may have some health-promoting benefits. So those are the big differences when we look at regular table sugar. Let's just take a look at honey possibly as a performance booster. What I want to do is refresh our minds about carbohydrates. It's always helpful rather than automatically assuming that we know what carbohydrates are utilized during exercise and what carbohydrates are in food. We'll look at fuel use and how sports performance products compare. So unlike what Kathy Carr had available and many of us aging athletes in our earlier years, we simply had different food sources. Now we have a whole line of specialty products well beyond sport drinks. We have different types of carbohydrate products, including some specifically made from honey. And then are there some possibilities beyond some of the traditional sports performance products that honey may offer because of the mix of other compounds, including polyphenols? So let's take a look at what simple carbohydrates are. If we look at strawberries, so any kind of fruit, Coca-Cola, or any beverage that's sweetened, and honey, as well as more traditional complex carbohydrates, potatoes and breads and pasta. We like to divide them up into simple and complex carbohydrates, and I'll remind some of us, or for some first time, what types of carbohydrates are in these food products. And the simple carbohydrates represent the monosaccharides as well as the disaccharides, and so glucose and fructose we'll find in fructose predominantly in fruits, and glucose, as we'll learn, the basic monosaccharide unit inside of us. Table sugar, brown sugar, sugar in the raw, natural cane juice, they're all the same thing as a sucrose unit with a green ball and a yellow triangle. And actually, I got to remind myself that I'm not talking, though it's hard to tell the difference between the 20-year-olds I talk to all the time. You guys don't have the background. I do use symbols in class that actually is helpful rather than showing the chemical structure of glucose, which I'll lose everybody. They're on their phones and on their laptops. I do symbols and cartoons a lot. So glucose, a 6-carbon unit, is a green ball. Fructose is a 6-carbon unit, but it's slightly different, so I put it as a yellow triangle. So table sugar is a glucose and a fructose, and everybody's usually shocked to learn that high fructose corn syrup is virtually identical to sucrose in that it's almost 50% glucose, 50% fructose, though without a bond. And in most of the beverages that we consume that are sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, by the time we get that those monosaccharides, whether it has high fructose corn syrup or if it has been sweetened with real sugar, due to the acidity level in many of these beverages, this typically we're presented with the monosaccharides at the small intestinal level. So we really don't view sucrose and high fructose corn syrup as being dramatically different from one another. So there's a rundown on the simple carbohydrates. Honey, by the way, is a mix. Depending on the type of honey it is, it's roughly 30% free glucose, 38% fructose, and a small amount of sucrose, but also an unusual disaccharide. Palatinose and pannose and arylose are both oligosaccharides, but this usually comprises about 2 to maybe 4% of the weight of the carbohydrate in honey. We tend to think in terms of performance level in counseling athletes that the profile of carbohydrates in honey is comparable to what we're going to find in sport drinks, what we're going to find in some of the others, and we'll take a look. So just as review, the complex carbohydrates, so the breads, pasta, and also what you'll find added to a lot of sport products, maltodextrin, are literally hundreds of glucose units stranded in either a straight chain or a highly branched chain. So what we might find in a red potato or some whole grain pasta or refined pasta is simply starch. Maltodextrin, a much shorter version, is used in a lot of sport products. You'll see rice syrup and the like added to different types of products, and it's simply a complex carbohydrate. A lot of athletes have the perception that this would be better than the sugar that's added, but we'll see shortly it ends up being literally the same thing. What's inside of a potato and what's on the outside, just so we can make a comparison, just to get a look at fiber, so the skin of a potato, or if it was the stringy part of celery or broccoli or the outer hull of a grain of rice. We have starch on the inside, and on the outside, or even more, a better description would be on the outside of a whole grain kernel, we also have a complex carbohydrate, and it's fiber that's simply of strands of glucose or other monosaccharide connected to one another with indigestible bonds. So that is a rundown of carbohydrates in the foods that we eat. What's inside of us? What are we after, and why are we after it? So this is our starch. We store carbohydrate in our body in the form of glycogen, and we're able to store these thousands of glucose units in a slightly, well actually a dramatically different structure than what we're going to find inside of a potato or what we'll find inside of a kernel of grain. Glycogen is a highly branched molecule that is made of the basic unit, same glucose unit, so a 6-carbon molecule of glucose that contains potential energy for us to use. And we store this in the muscle and liver, and it's available for that specific muscle to use. So glycogen in your right bicep is for that particular muscle and can be utilized during an exercise that muscle would be using. Liver glycogen we store primarily for the use of glucose being released out to the bloodstream for our brain. So we're able to store glycogen. It's a big bulky molecule, so we can't store a lot of it. We only put away about 1,500 to 2,000 calories worth of glycogen. And if you think about what that's worth, is maybe a loaf of bread, a small loaf of bread we have tucked away. It's such a big bulky molecule because water likes to hang around it. And so it takes up a lot of space. And fat, which doesn't like water much, or at all, it's actually our driest tissue, we're able to store an unlimited amount of fat calories. And so to contrast, we have, let's just estimate for a fit athlete who is able to store a bit more, 2,000 calories worth of glycogen. And fat calories, a lean athlete, 50,000 calories of fat. Many of us, we probably store 75,000 to 100,000 calories of fat. If we happen to say, well, how about if we were able to store more glycogen in our body, because it takes up so much space and so much water is stored with it, if we were to store more calories as carbohydrate, let's just shift places or switch them, fat with stored glycogen, we would weigh approximately 100 pounds more just due to the storage of water. So this is our best we can do, is about 2,000 calories total. It's the amount that's going to last us through a couple of hours at best of exercise. So our fuel stores in our body during exercise, we have glycogen, as I noted, in a very limited supply. We have fat as a storage, and protein. All of our protein is as either a muscle or part of an organ, or is a hormone for some digestive enzyme. So every stitch of protein you have in your body is there for a purpose. And so that is not used very much right now at rest unless you're in a fasted state. It's not used much during exercise, again, unless you're out of stored energy in the form of carbohydrate. So let's take a look. This is, if you can kind of see, the frame looks a little dark. This is a leg muscle, so we're just looking at what it would look like over a span of going out and running. If any of you this weekend get on your bike or go for a run, your body's going to have to resort to using stored fuel at a greater rate than what we're using right now, just for exercise. And during a bout of exercise, we're going to pull off glucose units one at a time, and this great chemical structure of glycogen allows a fair number all at once, until at the end of, depending on your exercise intensity, that glycogen in that specific muscle is exhausted. And then what ensues, and I'm sure Lou and any of us who have gone out for a long run or a long bike ride knows that feeling, that lead light, just heavy feeling. You're exhausted, you can't go any farther because you're out of the fuel source. You have ample fat stores. In fact, if you wanted to crawl the rest of your bike ride or the rest of your run, you could do so because it's at a much lower intensity and not being utilized since you're out of glycogen stores. So we have the ability to last, depending on the intensity. If it's a high intensity exercise for a very fit athlete, they can run out of glycogen stores anywhere from maybe 75 to 90 minutes. For some of us who are less fit, going at a lower intensity, it could last a couple of hours. So we have a need for carbohydrate. Being able to maintain our circulating levels of glucose, we actually have a limited ability there. We can last maybe a couple of hours, depending on the intensity, without any supplemental carbohydrate. So athletes actually have a reliance on carbohydrate during exercise. Active people, highly trained athletes, irregardless of your fitness level, if you're out there long enough, whether it's walking or you're able to ride 100 miles, you have a need to replace the carbohydrate that you're using up. So it makes sense to do so. So our limitations are, and we're not getting into loss of fluids, but our depletion of glycogen stores and also a drop in blood glucose level. And since your brain actually relies exclusively on carbohydrate as a fuel source, we're in need of it so that we don't hit that point of running out of steam that happens to so many people when they hit the wall or bonk. So the guidelines that the American College of Sports Medicine has come up with, and actually subsequently products have been formulated from this, is a recommendation, of course, to replace fluids, to avoid dehydration, but to look at carbohydrate replacement. And something rather new within the past about year or two is the whole concept in exercise that's lasting less than 60 minutes, but that you're waning. And if you've ever been at the club, working out at your gym, or maybe you're trying to exercise after work, a lot of us fitting in everything that we can do, and you haven't eaten for a couple of hours, maybe since lunch, so it could be a good 4 or 5 hours, that small amounts of carbohydrate, simply a mouthwash or a rinse, actually stimulates the central nervous system and performance is enhanced. So if you don't have time to eat, get a snack, or you don't want to, and you simply want to stay energized during your workout. Please don't do this next to the person running on the treadmill close to you, but you can simply rinse with a sport drink or a carbohydrate source and spit it out. And studies show that you actually will be able to last longer by doing that. So we're looking now at recommending mouth rinse of carbohydrate for exercise lasting less than around 60 minutes, but that an amount of around 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate every hour, because we have the ability at the intensity of anywhere from 60% of our maximal to up to 85% oxidizing carbohydrate at around a gram per minute. So that equates to us being able to tolerate and take in 30 to 60 grams every hour. This is 100 calories, so to relate that to a food, it would be a banana every half hour. And the goal is to anything that you're going to be doing longer than an hour, that you start replacement during that exercise within that first half hour, getting 30 to 60 grams. The recommendation from the American College of Sports Medicine is all sorts of products and foods like fruit, honey is one of them, different types of bars, and we have a whole array of products that we can select from. With this whole notion of replacing carbohydrate during exercise, we also have to consider people, and I don't know if any of you have decided to do ultra events or going longer than 2.5 hours. If you've ever been out and even walking a marathon or running a marathon that's going to take you that length of time, what has been shown recently through research, and the American College of Sports Medicine is recommending that 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour may not be adequate, that your glycogen stores will run out despite the fact that you're replacing carbohydrate on a regular basis. So what is recommended is to go up to 60 to 90 grams per hour and to utilize different carbohydrate sources. We know that carbohydrate absorption, there are different transport mechanisms at the level of the small intestine, and that consuming a glucose-fructose mix, such as what you would find in honey, not all sports products do have a mix of carbohydrate. Some now are adding ribose, galactose, which you may recognize as monosaccharides. So this is kind of the new area, looking at multiple transportable carbohydrates that will optimize carbohydrate absorption so that a person can last, for example, an Ironman distance triathlon that's going to go for 8, 10, 12, 15 hours. So there's certainly room for honey products or use of honey in that area. Before I compare the products, I want to just mention just yet another concept that we have to face or deal with and talk about, and that is glycemic index and what role that might play with athletic performance. A lot of athletes ask me, well, what's the glycemic index of that particular carbohydrate that they're consuming? And when you consume strict dose, a single dose of carbohydrate, as it's digested and absorbed, we'll see a rise in blood glucose levels. The green ball will rise in your blood. The magnitude of this rise is measured simply as the glycemic index. And that in a dose of 50 grams of carbohydrate, we can measure 100 being the high, that what we would find as a glycemic index for pure glucose, 50 grams, versus other foods that contain carbohydrates, such as apples or lentils, banana, honey. The glycemic index of a food actually isn't a function strictly of whether it's a simple carbohydrate or whether it's a complex carbohydrate. People like to believe that pasta or wheat bread would have a low glycemic index, and in fact they don't. Wheat bread has a glycemic index of about 100, and so does white bread, because of the small particles of the carbohydrate during the refining process. It's more a function of the fructose content, the fiber content, and if that food is mixed with fat and protein. So what does this all have to do with exercise? And if we just take a look, just for comparison, of some of the glycemic indexes in some basic foods, breakfast cereal, even a carrot, potato, most of these are high GI or high glycemic index. And you'll see, actually hear people who are working out talk about eating high GI foods or low GI foods, and all dealing with the timing around when they're exercising and when to replace it. The question is, how much of an issue does it mean? Most honeys fall in the range of a moderate glycemic index, though there are some that score along the lines of some of the winter fruit, and potatoes and beans, of course, with their soluble fiber, have a low glycemic index. Those of you that are paying attention to some of the news around diabetes and obesity and cancer have probably come across glycemic index with that. And there's some evidence that a diet based on low glycemic index foods, eaten in combination with foods that contain some protein and fat, may be beneficial for reducing the risk of some of these diseases, because there does seem to be some connection. As it relates to exercise, though, there's a way that you can fool around with the types of carbohydrates that you're eating and their glycemic index, and potentially for you as an individual, if you're affected this way, influence your performance. If there's a dramatic increase in blood sugar levels, blood glucose levels, upon the ingestion of carbohydrate, research shows that for some individuals, this may cause a rebound hypoglycemia later during exercise. And this in turn may inhibit, during the rise of insulin in response to the glucose, this actually may inhibit fat breakdown, lipolysis, which is not what an athlete wants when they're out running for a long period of time or riding their bike. So the advice oftentimes is, for most athletes, most active people, when they consume food prior to exercise, to emphasize low glycemic index foods. So you'll see a lot of people saying, oh, I can only eat apples, not a banana. As you might imagine, a lot of athletes can be very obsessive. I deal with this all day long, and they figure out what the best thing is to eat. There's some research that does show that it may enhance the use of fat during exercise, and if you can do that, you actually can help spare glycogen, which means ultimately that you might be able to run longer, not necessarily faster. You might be able to cycle longer and maybe make that 100-mile before feeling lousy maybe at 80 miles. So this can be beneficial, and the question is, how real is this effect? Many research studies show it may be an issue while others don't. So what do we generally recommend? So whether you know what your response is or not, what we usually recommend is that if you're going to eat a few hours before exercise, that you stick with typically low to moderate glycemic index foods. That might be your best bet. So oatmeal, a low glycemic index food. Top it with honey rather than sucrose. Rather than eating some of the fruits that have a high glycemic index, or like raisins and dates, to stick with apples and pears and oranges. And this is pretty common to set up pre-competition meals, whether it's soccer or whether it's basketball or running or swimming, to have an athlete eat a low glycemic meal. But eaten just prior to exercise, which when you're dealing with active people and they are going, especially the student athletes, they have class, then they zoom to practice, a 3 to 4 hour practice. I'm talking with the soccer team, the men's soccer team, on Monday, and they're really facing some challenges. They're right at the end of their season, and a lot of the players are having problems with their midday practices and games and the fluctuation in schedule. And we're going to talk about, okay, since you're going to shovel food in just before you hit the practice field, instead you can be eating higher glycemic index food immediately prior. So this is a way that honey might fit in, though we have a limited amount of research, and one particular study has looked at it as a manipulating glycemic index. So let's look at how honey compares to the products like Powerade and Gatorade, and also some of the other products that are out there, the carbohydrate gels. These are the consistency, a little bit thicker, more viscous than honey. They're like cake frosting or toothpaste, though they don't taste like toothpaste. And then some of the novel forms of carbohydrate replacement. Sport beans, the chews, these are like similar to gumdrops that are sold to athletes and active people as a means to get carbohydrate. Most of these products are a mix of monosaccharides and some disaccharides. They are sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. A lot of the gels also contain maltodextrins, and most of the novel carbohydrate products contain glucose and sucrose, though a few may throw in rice syrup as a form of maltodextrin. So you're going to find a variety of things out there. If we look at energy gels, and this I like to tell athletes that, you know, a honey packet actually is quite similar to this, that you're going to get roughly, depending on the brand, about 100 calories. And how many calories did we need every 30 minutes if you're working out? Does anybody remember? Claire? 100. This is what I tell Claire when we're out on bike rides. Did you have your 100 calories? So we're in between, so we'll go 100 calories, 25 grams of carbohydrate. They average right in between there. We don't want any fat and protein. We're not in need of that during exercise, and it actually slows digestion. Some of these are added compounds, little goodies like vitamins and some electrolytes, which is another discussion whether that might help with fluid balance. But caffeine, we know, is a central nervous system stimulant and very consistently makes athletes, active people, feel better during a bout of exercise. Actually, as little as 34 milligrams can help you feel more alert during a session of exercise. Another way that you can make it to a workout after you finish a hard day at work. Honey stinger product, there are some specific honey items predominantly from this company, and it compares quite well, and a lot of athletes I'm finding are using this, and I let them know that regular honey would really behave the same way. It's got 30 grams of carbohydrate, just over 100 calories, and they have versions that have added caffeine. So the question is, also with the chew product, these are similar to squared gut drops. And this particular one is made with honey. It's a honey stinger product. It has just a speck of fat in it and protein. They also have another product out that it's a waffle that looks like a honeycomb, and it has 7 grams of fat and several grams of protein, and it's designed for ultra-endurance athletes. And you probably won't come across it, but it is out there. It's very intense. It's like eating basically a very dense wafer of honey along. You can tell that there's some fat in it. So that's a rundown of just a few of the products, and I thought I'd tell you one of the 2 research studies that are out there looking at honey and athletic performance. And this one is a simulated bike race, 64 kilometers. And this particular study, done at the University of Memphis, published in 2004, looked at cyclists who were highly trained. They did a crossover double-blind study, and that they were given a solution, so like a honey sport drink. They mixed up 15 grams of honey, classified it as low glycemic index as measured, and 250 milliliters of water, and they were given this at the start, having had a standardized pre-race or pre-trial meal a few hours beforehand, so they were not in a fasted state. They were given this every 16 kilometers. They were also compared to a dextrose solution, a high glycemic index, obviously, with the glucose, or a flavored placebo, no carbohydrate. So this was done in a blinded manner, double-blinded manner. They looked at performance time, total time to finish the 64 kilometers. They're encouraged, if you've ever seen these research studies perform, they're really treated like race situations. They're in a laboratory on a stationary bike, but they are encouraged and enticed and told a lot of lies just so that they'll finish as fast as they can. And what was discovered was that their performance times for both carbohydrate treatments were comparable. They actually anticipated a difference, and they were hopeful for honey, but thinking that in this longer ride that the low glycemic index may sustain performance better, give them a better sprint time, but it did not at the end of the time trial for this approximate 60-kilometer ride. But what they did find was the power output, and the way to look at it is what kind of oomph were they able to put on each pedal stroke. And found that the honey in this particular incidence, it wasn't significant, but it tended to have greater power output when the athletes consumed honey during their time trial performance. Interesting. That's all that we can say because this wasn't replicated. So here's what it would look like if you were to go out. Maybe this weekend you have time to run a marathon. So here's what would be recommended to meet the carbohydrate replacement goals of the American College of Sports Medicine. To consume a variety of carbohydrate sources, but taking in honey, it would fit just great. You could stop at a restaurant that has little honey packets, make off with a few of them. That's what I tell athletes to do. Or you could buy your own and bring it. We will say it's a little bit messy to deal with honey, so that maybe you might want to try one of the honey products that choose as a way to go. But to mix it up with different types of carbohydrates, so you have the different mono and disaccharides, which may aid not only transport across the small intestinal wall, but also may be better tolerated. Here's what a bike ride would look like. If you were going to ride 100 miles, estimating a time of completion, taking at least 6 hours. Maybe some people can do it faster, but you're going to be stopping, and you want to talk about after mile 20 and 35, you have to sit and gab, and usually people stop and do a bit of a lunch break, but honey products certainly would fit in. Consuming carbohydrate gels would, regular food would, because cyclists have the advantage of not bearing their body weight against gravity, and they can usually tolerate greater variety, and not many runners would be eating a tomato sandwich in the midst of their marathon. So we can really switch up the types of foods, but this whole thing adds up to 300 grams of carbohydrate. Be sufficient for that athlete to finish in great style at the end of the 100 miles. But there's got to be a little bit more beyond carbohydrate in honey, and that's all that it potentially can offer as a health benefit. We know that there are a range of compounds in different plant products that certainly confer many health benefits, and that it's been noted that honey has these compounds, and measurable antioxidant capacity, and that these compounds, these in particular phenolics, have been shown to have beneficial effects in potentially lowering the risk for cancer, coronary artery disease, and what about potential benefit towards exercise or for exercise. I point you to an excellent review listed below that reviews some of the phenolics, and I have just a handful listed here. Caffeic acid, quercetin, and others that are found in a variety of different honeys based on the floral origin of that honey, and I'm not an expert on the phenolic compounds of these, but it has been noted through research, a handful of studies. Again, it's not a highly examined, as well as, say, blueberries and some of the other antioxidant-rich plant products, as to how well these phenolics make it into the circulation, so an in vivo versus just an analysis. I'll point you actually to a research study that was done here at UC Davis, another one that's noted here, that consumption of a fairly large quantity of honey, 9 tablespoons, a dose of 9 tablespoons of buckwheat honey, which is a very dark honey that has a fairly high phenolic compound relative to many other floral origin honeys, was compared with the consumption of black tea, the consumption of black tea with honey, the consumption of black tea with a sugar solute, with sugar added to it. And honey does notably increase the serum as measured by ORAC, a procedure to look at antioxidant capacity of the blood, and this research gives a great description. So noting that this may be measurable in people to enhance antioxidant components of the blood, and knowing that high intensity exercise certainly does produce rogue molecules that may promote and does lead to inflammatory response. Exercise-induced inflammatory response has been researched for a good 15 years, very much interest to the military because of the physical work that soldiers are doing. It's quite a bit of interest to people who do long bouts of exercise, as well as people who do high-intensity exercise. And when you look at exercise induced inflammatory markers, we know the relationship between these markers and the correlation between injury risk, illness, chronic fatigue syndrome. And so athletes are very interested in consuming anti-inflammatory compounds and are certainly looking to foods and natural approaches to help combat what they perceive as outcomes of their exercise training program. So I point you to the second study that has been done with honey and athletic performance. And in this particular one, they simulated a soccer game. So they took experienced male soccer players, approximately the age of a collegiate soccer player, 21 years of age, a large group of them. They randomized them into two groups, giving them either a gram per kilogram body weight of a sport drink, a commercially available one. The other group, they made up a honey drink, being the same 7% solution of carbohydrate provided at the American College of Sports Medicine recommendations. They simulated a soccer game, and believe it or not, this protocol for simulating a soccer game has been well researched and documented. It's a protocol that's used, time-tested and used in many research studies where they simulate play by doing agility drills, ball shooting, sprinting, continuous motion. And these athletes were allowed to drink much like soccer players. They do not have continuous availability to fluid and food. They were given either the honey drink or the sport drink just prior to the onset of the soccer match. They were given access to it and given a set amount to drink, 1 gram per kilogram body weight at halftime, 45 minutes into the simulated soccer match, and then again at the end. There were no observed performance benefits compared to placebo, which was shocking actually, and I'm surprised because they were out there for 90 minutes with minimal consumption really of carbohydrate, but it was not viewed as being superior. They looked at a series of inflammatory markers in response to the very intense exercise that these well-trained athletes were doing over the 90-minute period. And after the sport drink and placebo, a variety of markers such as interleukin-1 inflammatory markers were elevated. However, the honey treatment significantly blunted this. So this is of interest. This is research that was published 2 years ago, and I'm unaware of anything followed up. I do actually want to point out that this was from someone who went, and Lou probably remembers her, Dr. Janet Wahlberg-Rankin, who was a co-graduate student back in the day, and it was great to see that that was the research she put out. So we've got a handful of studies that are looking at honey consumption and inflammatory markers as well as coronary artery disease risk factors. One not particularly well controlled, and I've had quite a bit of difficulty finding some that really spoke clearly to what role consumption of honey as a sole sweetener in the diet might do to markers for different chronic ailments. And this particular one did the best job feeding honey at 70 grams per day, which is a fair amount of added sugar versus 70 grams of sucrose for a 30-day period, not a long period of time. And total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol were all modified in positive directions, but only a slight increase, but was considered significant, a 1 to 2% increase. And C-reactive protein, which you may know is a marker for inflammation correlated well with coronary artery disease, was reduced following the consumption of honey. So my look at it is there are some things out there that point to honey as potentially having some health benefits well beyond what we would see that would be in something like sucrose as a sweetener. So I want to leave you with a homemade sport drink recipe using honey, and this would follow the guidelines for the American College of Sports Medicine of adding 4 tablespoons of honey, remembering that 17 grams of carbohydrate in every tablespoon. Got to flavor it up with juice from half a lemon. Feel free to grind some cinnamon in there, add a sprinkle of salt, and that's to give you a tad of sodium so that you can help encourage the palatability of the beverage along with fluid absorption. And you know, I'm thinking since it's Friday and it's almost happy hour, go ahead and throw something else in there if you would like to, though I encourage you not to ride or run or drive home. okay? Thanks a lot.
Any questions?
Eric.
Liz, have you seen any studies yet that would kind of back up or not back up Fessenden thing about the fact that you might be able to bring down a pre-diabetic glucose level a little bit better?
Okay, the question is, would honey basically play a role in someone who is pre-diabetic, switching sweeteners in your diet, making an effort to have better, basically improved insulin sensitivity so that your fasting blood glucose level can be brought below what would be identified as pre-diabetic. There are a handful of research studies, not very convincing. However, it's intriguing. And there's some suggestion that some of the unusual oligosaccharides and disaccharides may change the insulin response and glycemic response. So there are a handful of research studies, but I'm really not impressed with their experimental design, and it was too dicey to present, but it's intriguing. And what's so fascinating about all this, it's almost as if people may assume, oh, the research has been done, I'll just not consider this as of interest. And for a sweetener that's been around, for millennia, why don't we know more about its health implications? And so it is intriguing. So there's room for certainly a lot to be done. Question?
How about the seasonal allergies? You're supposed to be able to accept
The loaded question. Is it true that if you consume honey every day that you will not get seasonal allergies? If you're consuming local honey in particular. And I am not an allergist, and I probably get that question every other day though. And I usually respond, if you find that it works for you, please go ahead. There's no harm. The research doesn't support it. Thanks.
In any of these studies, do they specify the source of the honey, how the honey was produced?
Okay, the question is, do they identify the source of the honey? In the soccer study, they used clover honey, and this is part of my concern. In many of the other studies, they do not identify. They say natural honey or native honey and do not identify the floral source.
Is there a difference in the chemical makeup between the different kinds of honey where the flowers are coming from?
The question about are there different chemical makeup or carbohydrate, looking just at the macronutrient versus the phenolic compounds. And there are slight variation. What I gave you was just on average what most honeys. As far as phenolic compounds, there are quite a variation. I'm not an expert in that area. I know, though, that there's some really good research articles that look specifically at the profile. Malaysian honey, for some reason, is, and maybe a honey person could answer that. That's pretty much all I found was Malaysian honey. Do you know? Is there a contingency of Malaysian beekeepers that are promoting this? Well, anyway, that's been well qualified. Okay, anybody going to work out this weekend? A walk, a run, try some honey? Okay. Oh, you have another one?
No, I'll work out.
Okay, good. All right, thanks. I think we're taped. Good afternoon. Thanks, Claire. Claire and I go cycling a lot. Well, ever since we both said I do. I recently, 6 weeks ago, got married, so I'm still on my honeymoon, so that's my connection to honey. So, thanks for the yay. It took a while. And my wonderful husband is here. You can raise your hand. Okay. I actually have kind of an interesting task, considering there's not much research looking at honey and athletic performance, but as Dr. Gravetti pointed out, honey's been around longer than all of us, but actually dating back to ancient times, honey has been used as a performance-enhancing aid. And just to spin off of Eric had brought this up this morning about consumers and honey. Interestingly enough, over the past, say, 4 or 5 years, consumers actually, fewer of them do have honey in their household. In a 2010 survey by the National Honey Board, about 60+% of the households had honey. Actually, that's down from the year 2006, probably due to the low-carb, high-protein craze. But what's interesting is that honey, people will pay a premium for honey-flavored products. And just anecdotally to let you know that since I do have to glean through over 550 diet projects every quarter, and actually I should tell you a little bit about what I do. And Claire said I have the biggest nutrition class every single quarter, just so you can appreciate what I deal with. I have 550 to 600 undergraduates in Nutrition 10 in one classroom. And then I have 10 sections of Nutrition 11, which is a writing course in nutrition. So every quarter I have 850 students, roughly, thereabouts. But then I'm also the director of sports nutrition, so I deal with all the hundreds of intercollegiate athletes, and they come through my office. So every day is basically from the beginning to the end is dealing and talking about diet with young people, young active people, and it's great. So I thought I'd give you some background to my Honey Nut Cheerios comment that it hands down is the favorite. And I actually say to have asked and had an athlete last week, oh, Honey Nut Cheerios, oh yeah, it's good for you, it has honey. So people do have the perception, and obviously, as Dr. Gravetti pointed out, medicinally, we've been believing in honey for years. So as far as honey's role in athletic performance, I do want to bring up that it's been around in things that may aid performance. Can it be as good as we know carbohydrate is as an ergogenic or work-enhancing aid? And just to give a brief comparison between a tablespoon of regular table sugar and a tablespoon of honey. So I'm comparing volumes, but because honey is a supersaturated solution, it does have a greater number of calories per tablespoon, 65 versus 49. Greater grams of carbohydrate. But what's interesting, and I want you to do a little note to self, that there are different carbohydrates present in honey, and the profile does vary a bit compared to table sugar, which is 100% sucrose, a disaccharide. Honey will look a little bit closer at in terms of its carbohydrate profile, but it has individual monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, and it also has a disaccharide, sucrose, and a handful of oligosaccharides, which are a bit bigger, more than a couple of monosaccharides put together, and it has a few unusual disaccharides in it. We also, because of bees' collection of pollen and nectar from plants, we can find trace amounts of, very small amounts of protein, specifically doing lots of yards, but it all comes down to a few seconds, literally. Kathy Carr West, is a breaststroker, and she was also as part of a relay team, and she said that they felt that they had the secret weapon using honey. She said that some people on some other teams use sugar cubes in between events because you have to swim some trials, so different heats of your event, and then whoever gets the top times moves on to the next heat. And Kathy said that they used to squirt honey down, really feeling very energized, and it's kind of interesting. She wasn't favored to win the gold medal or set a record in the 72 games, and she did both. She won 2 medals. But she also noted, she goes, oh, none of us would eat sugar cubes because they harken back to when they were, she did this when she was 16, not too many years before that when she was much younger. She would take sugar, or the sugar cubes were used as a means of dispensing the polio vaccine. So she said it wasn't the way to go, and nobody liked it. So as far as what do we know about honey and how it compares, we're going to compare carbohydrates, and we're going to do a little bit of Carb 101 here to help us get through it and talk about how could honey be considered as possibly something connection with athletic performance for some time. You go back to literature, it's been used at the Olympic Games back in ancient times. Soldiers have taken it out onto the field. And it is viewed by athletes as a healthier option. And the question is it really? Does it offer some advantages potentially? What I actually did, thinking about this many weeks ago and always talking to athletes about it, is I interviewed, if anybody could recognize this person in the Olympic attires. This is from the 1972 Olympic Games. This is Kathy Carr West. She actually lives in Davis. She won 2 gold medals at the Olympics in 1972. That's the same year that Mark Spitz won his, oh, whatever he won. But anyway, I know about what Kathy did. And actually, this is at a time when nutrition and athletic performance was really in its infancy. And Kathy shared with me what they used to do. And if you're familiar with how swimmers practice, they spend a lot of time doing a lot of yards or meters. They maybe swim 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters to swim a 100-meter event as fast as they can. So they spend quite a bit of time